The last part of that passage, verse 15, as it is written, comes from Exodus 16:18, and this is the passage in Exodus where they have received the manna from heaven. And there's a particular context for every passage of Scripture. And this passage in 2 Corinthians is particular to the early church. Something was happening, and it's tied to that context. The Jerusalem church was in need, and the people needed help, and so they were taking up an offering for those in the Jerusalem church. And so in this passage we see sort of an explanation. Why? Why are you giving? So that they may receive. And they needed to justify why some had to give in order for others to receive. Not much has changed, really. We still have those conversations regularly. There are still people who struggle with giving, even though giving can be one of the most joyous aspects of our Christian faith journey. We give not in order to receive, but in order to participate in God's work. We give in order to be a part of what God is already doing. And when we give that way, out of obedience to God, we experience far greater joy than we previously knew was possible. As is also the case with so many passages of Scripture, there's something deeper going on in these verses. God is at work, and the passage tells us something about God. And it tells us something about ourselves. We see in these verses shared humanity, one group sharing with another, one group seeing the needs of another group and identifying with it. Thomas Merton, that great American spiritual writer and a Trappist monk, wrote, "It's easy enough to tell the poor to accept their poverty as God's will when you yourself have warm clothes, plenty of food and medical care and a roof over your head and no worry about the rent. But if you want them to believe you, try to share some of their poverty and see if you can accept it as God's will yourself." And he ends the passage with an exclamation point, emphasizing that last point. And these are hard words because we don't necessarily want to empathize. We don't want to see and experience what somebody else is going through. Instead, we might feel sympathy. We feel sorry for somebody else's situation. We want to help in that way, but we don't necessarily want to walk in their shoes. And this passage from 2 Corinthians is dealing with a group of people that is no different from that. There were some people who were doing quite well in the Jerusalem church and needed some help. And it's like the people who are suffering from wildfires in Colorado this past week. We're not suffering from wildfires. And so it's hard to identify and empathize with being afraid that your house and all of your belongings is about to be consumed. There's a fire coming. We enjoy incredible freedom. So it's hard. And so much so that we're going to celebrate it as a national holiday this week. So much so, though, that it's hard sometimes to identify with those who are struggling for it in a place like Myanmar or in China. This morning we have a passage that encourages us to be faithful and to be generous in all of our dealings. It says, "But just as you abound in everything, see that you abound in this gracious work." Or another translation says, "this generous undertaking." Merton tells his readers that it's more important to practice what they say they believe than to preach it or proclaim it. And in 2 Corinthians 8:9, we read, "Though Jesus was rich, yet for our sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you or we might become rich." Sometimes we hear words like that, we get tripped up, we get distracted, because there are words that strike a chord. We know what rich means, we know what poor means, and so we start to fill in the blanks. We start to flesh out the passage to make sense for our lives, to make sense for what we think it's saying, instead of waiting to see what God is saying in the verses. Merton mentioned, in addition to food and clothing, medical care. I've always liked the book this came from, New Seeds of Contemplation. And I really like this quote, this passage. But this past week, medical care or health care has been very central to the news. People on all sides of the political spectrum, regardless of how they feel, seem to have very deep opinions about this subject. And the irony is that this quote from Merton came from a book, from the New Seeds of Contemplation, that was published in 1961. Now, I don't know what the healthcare debate was like at that time, but I do know that that wasn't his point. His point was much closer to what's happening in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Jesus, as the verse says, was rich, but became poor for our sake. Instead of getting distracted by this rich and poor language, think about it in terms of being in divine glory and the great richness that the Word who was, is, experienced, and came down to be with us, to empathize with us, to walk in our shoes, to identify with us, to get to know us. And by this sense of poverty, by this sense of coming down, this empathy, he was able to know how people behave. In fact, he was crucified and then raised from the dead. And in his resurrection, he became rich again. And by participating in his resurrection and in his life, we become rich in him. But again, there's that word, and we're not to be distracted by the word. This passage challenges people who proclaim to follow Christ to be generous in all of their dealings with other people. These verses are about equality and living as Christians, living out our faith the way that we're called to live. And whenever we read a passage like this, that is basically a theological dogma, it spells out something about God, it's easy to get distracted, to get tripped up in the language, because it's not like a story. You see the difference with the Mark passage from Mark 5? All you have to do is say the healing of Jairus' daughter. And for many of us, we go back to Mark 5. And I hope after today, you will go back to Mark 5 when you hear Jairus' daughter. And you think about God's dominion over death. But it's also true of other stories. Prodigal son, instantly. We all have opinions and ideas and images and thoughts and lessons. Good Samaritan. I don't have to say any more. The story conveys so much. But 2 Corinthians and other passages like it carry much more weight. Not than the story, but they're not as self-evident. They're not as easy to remember. We get distracted and we start to fill in the blanks. Reading the Bible like that, where we see a passage and we start to read along and we say, I know right where this is going. It's called eisegesis, E-I-E-S-E-G-E-S-I-S. I think I spelled that right. Eisegesis, and what that means is putting something into the text. That's not how we're to read the Bible. It means going to the Bible with a preconceived notion of how it's going to turn out, and then reading it and making sure that it does. Instead, what we're supposed to do is go to the Bible, read it, reread it, read it again, do whatever you need to do, but keep reading it and listen for God to speak, for God to reveal whatever message we are to receive, and to be open to that. Part of our church covenant is our promise to be just in our dealings. That's what I'm talking about in this covenant series this morning. Faithful in our engagements and exemplary in our deportment is what it says. Exemplary in our deportment. Deportment's kind of an old word, but it really means behavior, the way you carry yourself. We covenant to live our lives as Christians, to live out our faith. And specifically, as a part of this part of the covenant, we covenant to be just, to be fair, to be faithful, and to be an example in our behavior. And despite the distractions, despite the things that pull us away, like a tricky passage in 2 Corinthians, despite our own desire to understand Christian discipleship our way instead of listening to hear what God's way is, putting our own beliefs ahead of Christ. Despite all that, we are to seek Christ first. Seek to hear what God is telling us to do, what God is telling us to be. We're to push aside those distractions and continue in our engagement. And to continue walking in openness, seeking those opportunities to truly empathize, to truly see things as Christ would have us to see them. To do it with honesty and sincerity and openness to God. When we do, we can experience that great and incredible joy that knows no bounds. That great joy that allows us to sing, "To God be the glory, great things he hath done. So loved he the world that he gave his only Son." This is our calling and our faith journey.